Yeah, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar titled The Evolving Regulatory Landscape in the EU Opportunities and Challenges. And of course, we're talking about nicotine products and nicotine policy in this regard. My name is Carl Erik Luna. I'm Vice President of SCOHRE and also Senior Researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health in Norway. But Norway is not an EU member, so my knowledge on what's going on in the EU regarding tobacco harm reduction and nicotine policy is weak, and that's why we have a couple of other speakers with us this afternoon who are better suited than me to provide an update of the EU policy. I'll introduce them accordingly, but first I have been asked to provide some general introductory reflections on the legitimacy of nicotine regulations. And I'll try to shed light on some dilemmas that policymakers and regulators meet when crafting policy within this field. So my talk will serve as a background for the subsequent speakers who will consider policy more from the perspective of the consumers. Myself, I worked nearly 40 years in tobacco control and tobacco research, and for the entire period, my employers has been governmental entities, and I have been carrying out evaluations and monitoring work, but also acted as a consultant in policy matters and helped designing nicotine policy. And with this background has put me in a position where I have gradually learn to recognize and understand the regulators' mindset when they shape nicotine policy. So my approach this afternoon will be to try to explain to the audience the perspective of the regulator, the top-down perspective, if you like, the type of dilemmas that we face. And the overriding dilemma of the regulator is what has to do with paternalism. In which regulators, when proposing policy interventions of some kind, has to determine the line between an ethically justified interference and the exaggerated infringement of the nicotine user's right to live as they choose as informed and complying individuals. And here the problem starts because some would argue that nicotine users are not informed and not complying. And that gives the regulators the necessary justification for putting up some kind of barriers in order to escort users to a lifestyle the regulators has decided is better for them. But if we dig into the literature on nicotine behavior and perception, we will soon learn that most users are in fact aware of the risks and even overstate the risks. And in most countries, users pay a tax high enough to cover externalities they inflict on society, so they sort of pay their way. And studies also indicate that consumers use their nicotine device, whatever it might be, in designated areas without bothering others. And in most Western countries where tobacco advertising is banned or heavily restricted, and we have display bans and plain packaging and so on, users make decisions uninfluenced by persuasive messages from manufacturers. So in this situation, if users are informed and complying, a tightening of restrictions on nicotine use may appear ethically challenging for regulators. And moreover, the paternalistic dilemma of nicotine control will become quite intrusive if a sizable fraction of the informed and complying users want to continue to use nicotine, whether it's through smoking, vaping, chewing, or sucking on a device or some kind. So next, I will introduce you to three different typologies of nicotine users divided by their desire to continue using. And the first typology is the dissonant users. And these people are in a state of what the Greek philosophers labeled akrasia. They continue to use against their own will. They continue to use with a nudging feeling of discomfort because their behavior does not align with their beliefs, and their beliefs are that their behavior is hazardous and they ought to quit what they're doing. And consequently, they are quite receptive and quite supportive of any restrictive measure from the regulators because these measures could then help them to a self-binding kind of a commitment to be locked in a more credible behavior in the future. So this is the regulator's dream crowd. so to speak. They're kind of pushovers putting up very weak resistance and might even be supportive of barriers to the use. So in the middle, you have the ambivalent users with a mixed feeling about their nicotine use. This is an unstable crowd with fluctuating interest in quitting. If there's such a thing as a stage model for behavior change, then these people bounce back and forth between the different maturation phases. So they're a bit unpredictable, which leaves us with the constant users of nicotine. They are perfectly aware of the risks. They're willing to pay the price. They sense and are aware of the hostile norm climate for nicotine use, but the positive aspects of continued use outweigh the negative ones. So their interest in quitting is modest, and consequently, they don't want to be pushed by interventions from the regulators. So for the regulators, it's important to know how users are composed across these three segments. What is the relative size of each typology? A huge segment of dissonant users will give the regulators weak resistance, while the large segment of consonant users means trouble for the policymakers. So the relative size of these three segments will, of course, differ according to what nicotine product the users consume. The risk difference between nicotine products is huge, so the state of dissonance is probably more common among smokers than among users of non-combustible products. And in a paper we published last year, we focused on smokers and tried to identify the size of dissonant and consonant segments of smokers measured by their self-stated interest in quitting. Now, regulators are often being told that by anti-smoking activists that approximately 70 or 90% of the smokers in fact want to quit cigarettes. But such estimates often emerge from one-item indicators. Now, you ask questions like, would you like to stop smoking, with binary response categories, yes or no. Now, in our study, which you can see here on the left, we used multiple items with a 5-point rating scale and an additive index to measure quitting interest. It's probably a more valid measure. And I can't go in detail here, but what we observed was that approximately 30% fell into the category of dissonant smokers with a pressing urge to quit cigarettes. 20% were ambivalent, and about half were consonant smokers with weak or very weak interest in smoking cessation. And as I said, because non-combustible nicotine products carry a small fraction of the risk from smoking, a much larger proportion of the users of vapes and snus and pouches will probably belong to the consonant segment. So as I started out saying, the paternalistic dilemma for regulators will be quite intrusive when a sizable fraction of the users want to continue. And 50% is a large segment, and the proportion is probably much higher for consumers of nicotine products with reduced risk. So this will prompt the question, do regulators have the right to override the consonant smokers' wishes and forcibly help them quit nicotine by implementing constraints that the regulators think will be in the user's self-interest? As I said, I've been 40 years in tobacco control, and I think most regulators have a self-image of a beneficial helper. They think or have been told by activists that a great majority of nicotine users are in a state of dissonance and therefore will welcome constraints and barriers because that will help them to overcome their weakness. So in the regulator's mindset, they sort of are driven by the charity principle and clear ideology. They have good intentions and they want to assist those who, due to some decision failure, continue to use against their own will. They think they provide dissonant users with opportunities to reintroduce self-regulation and comply with their real wishes, and they want to help dissonant users to self-binding, a pre-commitment to be locked in a more credible behavior in the future. But by doing this, the regulators automatically exalt themselves to decide what is in the user's actual enlightened self-interest. they sort of ignore users' self-determination for the sake of their own good, and they elevate their nicotine-free value to a universal matter of common cause for the whole society. So regulators are quite aware that they could be perceived as being patronizing and arrogant. And with such self-awareness, some, but not all, but some will perhaps ask themselves the question, will our self-directed takeover of protection of the users turn us into terrorists with a dominant attitude of superiority that will negatively affect the quite sizable fraction of consonant users whose use is rooted in hedonistic and functional and therapeutic reasons, as illustrated in this slide. So for the sizable segment of consonant users, the help argument to justify interventions to curb nicotine use might appear unwanted, punitive, and coercive, and may inflict loss of welfare, loss of autonomy, and further social disqualification, and may appear socially regressive because already vulnerable population will be hit the hardest. I'm getting towards the end now. I have presented some dilemmas that regulators will meet when imposing restrictions on nicotine use and crafting nicotine policy. But to what extent are these dilemmas acknowledged and internalized and serve as a guide for policymakers? Well, that will, of course, depend on what advice they will receive from their subordinate advisors in the bureaucracy who are there to serve them, servants like me, for instance. In an ideal preparatory case setting, before crafting the actual nicotine policy, researchers like me, policy strategists, bureaucrats, and state administrators should feel obliged to make their policy makers aware of and forward the dilemmas to their superiors. You know, the issues of paternalism, the fact that we have consonant use, that there are some ethical limitations when applying the health argument, and so on and so forth. But in reality, when nicotine policy is being crafted, researchers and political strategists and so on are more comfortable to come up with evidence in support for the policy the minister has decided to pursue anyway. Because even constructive objections or reflections on these dilemmas I have showed you will be regarded as unwanted input and problematic and probably delaying. It's a sign of wavering uncertainty. So people like me and others risk being labeled disloyal to the minister and then consequently sidelined and perhaps losing future assignments from the ministry. And we might even be accused of being a mouthpiece for the industry. And that's why we often end up with the policy-based evidence instead of evidence-based policy in this field, I think. Instead of forwarding decision makers with these dilemmas I've showed you, we simply find it more comfortable to search for the evidence that supports the pre-decided policy and fall into line. So some might disagree here, but after all, this is my impression after 40 years in tobacco control, tobacco research. So this was my general introduction. The SCOHRE administration will make the presentation available to all in a couple of days, I'm told. So then we will go next. Let's see if I can go do this. Yep. Okay, next up is Dimian. Dimian Sweeney is from Donegal in Ireland. Dimian is a founding member of the Consumer Advocacy Association and New Nicotine Alliance in Ireland, and is also partner with the European Tobacco Harm Reduction Advocates, ETHRA. And I'm sure Dimian will give us an overview of the organizations and what they do. And while I took the perspective of the regulator Damien will approach this topic from the bottom-up perspective of the consumer, I think. So Damien normally don't do webinars and stuff like that, so I had a hard time persuading him into this. So thank you for your compliance, Damien. And the title of your talk is What Consumers Need from the Regulators. Please.
Thank you very much, Carol. So I'll just give you a little bit of background to how I got involved with consumer advocacy. I'd smoked cigarettes for around 20 years and tried numerous times to quit with traditional methods. And it wasn't until I found vaping in 2016 that I was successful quite quickly, in fact. But unfortunately, about 4 weeks after I had found vaping and quit smoking, the TPD came into full effect. And even though I didn't know a whole lot about the area at that time, I could see that there were measures within the TPD that were not beneficial, such as arbitrary limits on nicotine content and container sizes and things like that. So my initial reaction to that was to contact policymakers in Ireland. It's just kind of what came to me. And from there, I met with other consumer advocates on social media, and we contacted policymakers and did all those types of things. And we decided to form NNA Ireland just to give us a platform. So we did. We came together and formed NNA Ireland, and we registered NNA Ireland as a charity as well. About a year after that, we joined ETHRA as a partner association. ETHRA is a European-wide consortium of 24 consumer associations in 17 different countries, and we're supported by experts in tobacco and nicotine science and policy. An important part of ETHRA as well is that we're entirely independent of industry, and we represent roughly 27 consumers of safer nicotine products in Europe. By those products, I mean snus, pouches, vapes, and heated tobacco. Now, ETHRA is in a fortunate position that we're actually a recognised stakeholder by the EU institutions. And because of that, I've participated in countless consultations and workshops at every stage of the Tobacco Excise Directive and the Tobacco Products Directive. Now, through those meetings, we've gotten somewhat of an insight into what the Commission might be thinking for the next TPD. We took part in a validation workshop with a group called Open Evidence, who were tasked by the Commission with the revision of the legislative framework for tobacco control. One of the main things that came out of that meeting was they were mainly focusing on risks and young people and not focusing on opportunities. A large part of the discussion was about the possibility of including nicotine pouches in the EU-wide snus ban, which would be awful. There's also a focus on flavours, the usual debate that I'm sure everybody is aware of with flavours, and just restrictions. It was all about restrictions. And then if we look sort of wider to member states within the EU, presently I think there's almost half of EU member states have either implemented or are talking about vape flavour bans. We have also got limits on nicotine content for nicotine pouches. There was a delegated directive a few years ago which would implement a complete flavour ban on all heated tobacco products. But on the nicotine limits for pouches, probably one of the most egregious ones is Spain at the minute, and they have set the nicotine content so low that the products just aren't viable. It's so low, they'd be useless. But for me, when it comes to regulation, one of the biggest concerns, as I mentioned, with so many member states is that you could reach a tipping point where you have half of member states or more that have implemented this policy, and the Commission may just say, we'll just harmonise across the board. Now, these types of policy decisions, they're quite important in relation to one of the EU's flagship initiatives, which is the Beating Cancer Plan. Now, they set a goal of being tobacco-free by 2040, and in my opinion, that was the wrong target. What it should be is a smoke-free target, because we know the cancer-causing properties, it's combustion is the problem. It's not, like heated tobacco products can offer smokers a way out. So, if the goal was to beat cancer, the focus should be on combustible tobacco and a smoke-free target. It shouldn't be on products that help people actually quit smoking. and reduce the risk and vastly improve their health. That to me is where it should be, particularly in the context that there's approximately 700,000 smoking related deaths every year in the EU. So, restricting products that people use to quit smoking won't help you hit those goals. So the title of my talk, what do consumers need from the regulator? It's quite straightforward, but probably also complex. What we require is science-based, risk-proportionate regulation of all those safer nicotine products. The main point, I think, would be appeal. The products have to be appealing. So, controversial point, perhaps, in the absurdity that is the flavour debate, but adults actually like things that taste good. Just, shock horror. So if you have a product that's appealing, you're more likely to get people to switch and move away. And I can just give an example of the importance of flavours from a survey ETHRA carried out in 2020. It was almost 37,000 consumers of nicotine products across Europe. And what we found was that for snus users, 73.7% had completely stopped smoking, 83.5% of vapers had completely quit smoking. And when it comes to the flavour aspect, less than 6% of the vapors surveyed said they used only tobacco flavour. Tobacco is kind of important because when we talk about flavour bans, the only one they tend to want to keep is tobacco. So, it's one flavour, it's a de facto ban anyway. And just again on flavours, more of a kind of personal story. My mother smoked cigarettes for 50 years, had tried numerous times to quit without success, the usual story. And she eventually wanted to try vaping. And we tried almost every flavour that you could think of under the sun, all the tobacco flavours, nothing worked. And it wasn't until I found one specific flavour, which was a hazelnut, caramel, and vanilla. She completely quit smoking within 2 weeks. And that was 7 years ago, and she still hasn't smoked since. So that's just a more personal story of the importance of flavours. And another point that doesn't get raised enough with flavours, I think, is that policymakers and tobacco control want us to use NRTs. There isn't an NRT available that comes in a tobacco-only flavour, so I wonder why that is. Do you know? So the other point I would say is affordability. It's a price sensitive area. So if alternatives to smoking are too expensive, people won't switch. Accessibility is another vital point. And I'll just quote my NNA Ireland colleague on this one, Tom Gleeson. Safer nicotine products should be available everywhere combustible tobacco is. Another point to make is that a wide range of products is extremely important. And I can use another personal story in that respect. My brother, he smoked cigarettes for 20 years as well, and he had tried vapes, didn't work, tried nicotine pouches, didn't work, tried heated tobacco products. Again, almost overnight, this product worked. So what worked for me didn't work for my brother. What worked for my mother didn't work for my brother. You need this wide range of products if you want people to switch away. So after mentioning what could be coming down the line and what other member states are doing, the important question is unintended consequences. So we know what happens when you start to ban things. We've seen it. You get a black market, you get smoking rates that stagnate or increase. You get workarounds that could be potentially harmful, where you have people trying to mix their own e-liquids, for example. And just to go back to the ETHRA survey on this as well, one of the questions that we asked people was, if flavours were banned, what would you do? And over a quarter of respondents said that they would go back to smoking. Close to 3/4 of people said they would use the black or slash grey market. So, I mean, we have evidence from the war on drugs that's been going on for decades that bans don't make these products disappear. They change the distribution network from a legal regulated market to an unregulated illegal market. So with that in mind, why should policymakers talk to or listen to consumers? Well, if you go back to the old harm reduction adage, nothing about us without us, that says it all. We're the affected group. what happens in this policy area directly impacts our lives. So you should talk to us. And I have a very good example from the Special Committee on Beating Cancer. There was an exchange of views during that committee meeting, and a German MEP stood up, and her opinion was that we don't need any flavours apart from tobacco flavour. That's all they need. So we're being dictated to by policymakers, not listened to. And my response was, there's 27 million of us. Why don't you actually ask some of these people that are using these products, what we need, rather than dictating and saying, this is what you need. So that's the reason we're the affected group. You should ask us. We'll be more than happy to tell you. We're your constituents as well. So that's another point. So what consumers do to get involved with the legislative process, that's quite a difficult one. When it comes to the EU, it can be quite difficult. There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of institutions, there's a lot going on. So the best thing people can do is join a consumer association that's already formed, or do what myself and Tom Gleeson did and start your own consumer association. The advocacy associations that have been around have been doing this a long time. They can help you navigate the legislative process. They can advise people on who to write to, when to write to them. And for the EU, this is important because there's different committees. The likes of the TPD can be in different stages, so we can advise on what to do and what to write. And I would also say get involved at a national level first, just to get used to engaging with politicians. And a very important point to remember when writing and talking to politicians is that they work for us, not the other way around. So don't be afraid to reach out and raise your concerns and tell them, this is what could happen if you go with this policy. This is how it'll affect me. This is how it'll affect my family. And just don't be afraid to do that. And the final point on this is be persistent. And I also have experience in this. There was one Irish MEP that I really needed to talk to, who was a permanent member of the Special Committee on Beating Cancer. And it took me 11 months of emails and phone calls until I finally got that meeting. And it turned out to be quite a productive meeting. So don't lose heart if you're a consumer advocate. Keep trying, write your emails and send your emails in your own words, telling your own stories, because that authenticity absolutely matters. But be persistent. Phone them as well. Don't just let it go. Keep at it. And that is all for me for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Damien. That was brilliant, very clearly put. Thank you for providing the perspective of the consumer, and also for the good advice. We keep receiving some questions and comments in the chat box. We will attend to those accordingly, and we also will try to return to some questions at the end. But because Professor Fall will leave us a bit early, we have to move on. And next up is Clive. Clive Bates, who should be familiar to most of us, I think, having served in tobacco control research for decades. Many will remember Clive as an outspoken leader of ASH in the UK, but since then he has ran his own information office, the Counterfactual, which is a very useful resource for anyone interested in nicotine policy. So Clive, are you with us?
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay. Hi, I'm with you. I'm with you.
Okay. We're very thrilled to have you to speak for us, Clive. I think you're the reason why we have a record number watching this webinar this afternoon.
Oh, really? Oh, well, there we go.
And the title of your talk is What Can and Should Be Done, Tobacco Control version 2, I think. Yeah?
Yeah, 2.0.
Thank you.
Okay, I mean, my basic premise is that a lot of the big ideas in tobacco control were formed in the 1990s, implemented in the 2000s, and have become irrelevant or impractical in the 2010s and 2020s. So I've got a lot of material to show you, which I'm going to go through at lightning speed, but I hope you'll find it interesting, get a sense of what I'm talking about. I should say that I have, there we go, I'm sharing now, yeah? Okay, so first I should say I don't have any conflicts of interest, so let's just deal with that. 1997, a simpler time. This is when I started in tobacco control as the director of ASH. We had cigarettes, lots of varieties of cigarettes. We had shops selling cigarettes. We had ludicrous advertising in magazines and on billboards. We had packets with labels on. That was supposed to be the main form of risk communication. We had restaurants and bars, hotels where smoking was permitted, much to the irritation of me and many others. We had very simplistic tests for cigarettes, tar, nicotine, and carbon monoxide yields. We had fake harm reduction. We had the scandal of lights and mild cigarettes, which were based on a deception and a misunderstanding in public health as well, I should say. We had fantastic bad guys. I mean, you don't get any badder than these. This is the tobacco industry CEOs talking to the talking to Congress in 1994. All men, all horrible. And we had what we now know to be a sort of gigantic amount of harm. Hang on a second. It's not working right. Killing around 8 million annually, 700,000 in the EU. And this amount of excess death is roughly similar to what we were getting from COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021. There was about 16 million excess deaths over that period associated with COVID. So we're talking about something gigantic that should require major intervention. I would say in 1997, we had incredible clarity of goals, okay? Now, these are some of the possible goals you can have if you work in tobacco control. And they go through, you know, everything to do with well-being, reducing disease, reducing addiction, reducing smoking, tobacco, nicotine use, substance use, secondhand exposure, smokers' rights, suing, you know, being anti-tobacco industry, suing people, destroying the tobacco industry and having a great career. Okay, and more or less in 1997, we could say all of the above. Cigarettes were the problem, and if you dealt with cigarettes, you'd be basically achieving almost all of these. It's become much more complicated since then, as I'm going to come back to. We also had a pretty simple tobacco policy agenda in various forms. This is Empower. This is the one that WHO and the Bloomberg groups use. So there was a standard package of tobacco control measures, which, you know, were coded into the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and were given some effect in EU legislation. We don't really need to go into them. They're all the things that you're familiar with: taxings, warnings, bans on this. Some of the, you know, a lot of the things that Carl Eric was talking about earlier, various forms of, you know, coercion, punishment, stigmatizing. That was what was in the sort of toolbox for, you know, making you quit smoking for your own good. All of this found expression in the European Union. So there's three main directives: Tobacco Excise Directive, setting taxes on cigarettes; Tobacco Products Directive, updated in 2001, 2014, and probably will start the process again in 2026. And then a Tobacco Advertising Directive that pretty well banned all forms of cross-border tobacco advertising. Most recently, we've had an updated recommendation on smoke-free environments. None of that that's not binding, because the EU doesn't have jurisdiction on smoke-free environments, but it's a common sense of what you should do, and it unfortunately includes general vaping bans. The two on the left are likely to be updated over the next couple of years, and there is going to be quite a lot to play for in them, as we're going to come back to shortly. That we have a goal in the EU to get to less than 5% of adults using tobacco by 2040. It should be smoking, because this is part of the Europe's Beating Cancer plan, and if it's about cancer, you should focus on smoking and not tobacco. And there's an interim goal, which is about to get percentage of smoking down to about 20% by 2025. Very unlikely that that will be met, as it was hovering around 24% in 2023. Now, I think we need to sort of pause here because that's my sort of that's the situation. I do not think nicotine use is going to go away. I agree with Carl Eric on that. People like it for various reasons. So the first thing we have to do if we want to regulate in this market, and we should think of it as a nicotine market rather than just a tobacco or a smoking or cigarette market. It's a market for nicotine. We have to understand why people use nicotine. Mike Russell, people smoke for the nicotine but die from tar. It's a very famous quote. But why do they smoke for the nicotine? What's that all about? Okay, now, nicotine is a psychoactive drug. It produces rewarding psychoactive effects, like caffeine does, like alcohol does, like cannabis does. That's not a recommendation. That's just a fact. It has an effect on people, a kind of buzz, a kind of stimulation, a kind of relaxation. And that's why people use it. It isn't a mystery. That's why people use it. Now, that's a scientific view of this. This comes from Neil Benowitz, who's probably the world's preeminent expert on nicotine. He did a very neat presentation not that long ago. And he said, what are the reasons why people use nicotine? And there they are. Pleasure, stimulation, cognitive enhancement, relaxation, mood modulation, psychiatric benefit, enhanced athletic performance, and weight control. And when he put it, I'm like, where do you get this drug? Because that sounds like quite an attractive package to me. Now, again, it's not a recommendation. And he points out that some of these things might be, effects of withdrawal, but it is an explanation. It is an explanation for why this drug is used by around 1.3 billion people worldwide. It's not all irrational. And that is not something that's going to stop. If anything, it's going to increase because we're making the products very much safer. And talking of the products, we now have a range of nicotine products without smoke. As Mike Russell said, people smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar. So we now have a large range of products in 4 broad categories that don't really expose the user to tar. So vaping products, heated tobacco products, oral nicotine products, and smokeless tobacco, including snus. Okay, these products are, beyond any reasonable doubt, far safer than smoking, and that's because they do not expose the user to inhalation of burning toxic tobacco smoke. I think that's why they are much safer. It's a basic idea of physics and chemistry. I'm not going to go into all the evidence of this, but there's a huge amount of evidence now that supports that. Obviously, we don't have 50 years of epidemiology for all of this, so we do for snus, which I'll come back to. But we have a great deal of evidence that these products are going to be much less hazardous ultimately than cigarettes. I want to jump now to the proof of concept for this. And this is the case of Sweden, where we have a large amount, a very low level of smoking. That's the blue bars. But we have high nicotine use expressed mainly through the use of snus, a smokeless tobacco product. And just at random, I want to compare that with Germany, okay, which has a much higher level of smoking, but a lower level of total nicotine use because there is no real alternative nicotine use. This is prior to the vaping era. So this is just looking at tobacco use. So there's no one using snus. So Germans smoke a lot, but the total amount of nicotine use is less. Let's look at the difference in lung cancer between Sweden and Germany. This is it. This is from IARC. You can see here, in both cases, they've been trending down, but Sweden is about half the level of lung cancer as Germany. Okay, and that's because the smoking rates in Sweden are much lower. Now, at this point, people would normally say to me, aha, but what about oral cancer? What about cancer of the mouth, the throat, the lips, and what have you? Well, let's look at the position with oral cancer. Here it is plotted on the same scale. Again, it's a comparison of Germany and Sweden. First of all, the very much lower levels of both of these. So the lung cancer is the big devastating one. And for Sweden, it's still about half what it is in Germany. And that's because smoking is a cause of lip, oral, pharynx cancer as well. Okay, so here we have absolutely clear, it's really, really clear, there's no other conceivable explanation for the difference, is the fact that Swedes use nicotine in a different way to Germans. Germans smoke more, they use less nicotine in total, but Swedes smoke less and use more nicotine in total. The result is a much lower level of cancer in Sweden. What have we done? In one of probably the worst policy decisions of all time, snus, the cause of these numbers in Sweden, has been banned in every country other than Sweden in the European Union, including in Germany. So German smokers, German citizens do not have lawful access to this product. And and that, in my view, for the last 30 years is despicable. There's around 100 million smokers in the European Union, and most of them are denied access to the product that has made Sweden so successful from a public health point of view. Anyway, we cannot loiter on this. We must move on. Smokers switching to vapes versus abstinence. This is a typical, one of the reasons why we know that vapes are much less hazardous. We look at biomarkers of exposure, and this is a range of chemicals in vapes as ingested into the body, measured in the blood, the saliva, or the urine. And what we can see is deep reductions in exposure. The orange and grey bars are two types of vaping product, and the blue bar is what you get if you abstain completely. And you can see that all of them show reductions that are roughly comparable to abstaining completely. Okay, roughly comparable, not exactly the same, except the nicotine one. Okay, where you get a small reduction in nicotine. That's the one on the far right. You get a smaller reduction in nicotine, but that's the purpose. People are vaping for the nicotine, but they're not dying from the tar, which are these other biomarkers. People have attempted to put a spectrum of risks together. You'll be familiar with this, with combustible cigarettes at the top, and then these other smokeless products, smokeless tobacco, heat not burn, electronic cigarettes, nicotine replacement therapy, and so on. An order of magnitude in lower risk. No one knows precisely. I mean, these numbers given to one decimal point are a bit ridiculous, but the point is an order of magnitude in reduction and a significant difference, a drop off, a cliff between the combustible products and the non-combustible products. To explain how this works, I think we have to think in harm reduction as two characteristics, really. First of all, the reduced risk of the product, which is the product toxicity and other risks associated with it, you know, explosions or whatever, fires. And then the number who switch, net. Who is using these products who would otherwise have smoked? And that's a function of who tries and how many, and the proportion who succeed, okay? And these characteristics are all about appeal, user choice, about whether people will pick these up in a shop instead of smoking, and whether they succeed is how good the user experience is. So all the people, you know, the German MPs, people on the chat who think it's a good idea to degrade the user experience, essentially are making it less likely that this approach will succeed and that more people will smoke as a result. And that's the big message that people have to take away. You mess up the value proposition with these products, more people smoke. The NHS in the UK has tried to capture this for vapes. Also, as vapes or e-cigarettes, far less harmful than cigarettes and can help you quit smoking for good. They're not recommended for non-smokers and cannot be sold to people under 18. I would say they should not be recommended to people who would otherwise smoke, and that's a little nuance we might come back to later. In Britain, we've seen an increase as vaping has increased. We've seen a rate increase in the rate of decline of smoking, which is good. And we now look as though we're on target to meet our 2035% target, which is the same as the EU has for 2040 for smoking only. Okay, that's providing the government doesn't mess it up with the new tobacco and vapes bill. Japan, fascinating here. We've seen cigarette sales decline by 50% in about 10 years. Absolutely amazing change. Independent research showing this. Absolutely amazing change in such a short time to crush crushed the cigarette market by 50% in 10 years. And that's all down to heated tobacco products. New Zealand, absolutely incredible progress with the most marginalized populations, the Maoris. And you can see the red lines, a rapid uptake of vaping and a dramatically accelerated decline in Maori smoking as a result. So that's just an overview of some of the successes. But the thing I really want to focus on now is how well tobacco control works in this sort of new environment. You know, if you think all of this is terrible and you just should ban it, or you should ban flavors, should raise taxes, what's likely to go wrong? Now, I said in 2019 that regulators will start to be taught lessons about the limits of their power by consumers, by markets and internet commerce, and overseas entrepreneurs. And I do believe that is now being borne out in practice. And it should be a warning to the EU institutions about blundering into this marketplace with the wrong type of regulation. First thing is to say that we have to think in terms of unintended consequences. So you put some kind of regulation in place and you get adverse behavior change. So instead you do something, let's say you put a nicotine cap on, or you ban vaping flavors. Instead of people becoming abstinent and doing more, you know, kids doing more homework, or you know, adults, you know, taking up marathon running, instead what happens is that you get adverse behavior change and they smoke instead. Okay, so that's the first category of unintended consequences. The second is that you try and change people's behavior. They don't like it. They carry on trying to conduct the behavior that they always wanted to. So you get illicit trade. Criminal networks supply the demand that legal suppliers can no longer supply. Okay, and we're seeing a lot of that worldwide. We'll touch on that in a minute. Okay, and there's reasons to think that that's going to be a growing thing. Finally, workarounds. So somebody says, okay, I'm going to ban your flavors. Guy gets in his garage, buys some flavors online, mixes them himself in possibly incredibly insanitary conditions, mixing things he has no idea what he's doing with, and, you know, essentially gets the product he wants, but with a whole set of additional extra risks associated with working around regulation. You know, he could get, you know, microbiological problems. He could add toxins. He could add oil-based flavors or what. So workarounds will happen as people try to do what they want in the face of regulation, but they increase risk. I'm not the first person to say this. The Royal College of Physicians highlighted this risk in 2016. So if you take a risk-averse and precautionary approach to e-cigarettes, and you could easily say pouches, heated tobacco products, you make them less easily accessible, less palatable, more expensive, less consumer-friendly, pharmacologically less effective, or you inhibit innovation, then the danger is you cause more harm by perpetuating smoking. Okay, so that's a recognized and understood concept in the public health literature, and we need to be more aware of it than ever. Okay, so the thing I want to say as we begin the process of modifying these EU directives is that tobacco and nicotine policy making is really the art of navigating trade-offs and unintended consequences. Okay, let's look at a couple of examples. So some people think you should ban flavors. Okay, and flavors are at the heart of vaping, and pouches for that matter. They make the products interesting, tasty, nice, delicious, and people wouldn't like them if they didn't have flavors. It'd be a bit like pizzas without flavors or only one topping. You wouldn't necessarily find them so appealing. There's been talk about having a flavor ban, and some EU member states have already banned vaping flavors. Okay. What do we know about the possible unintended consequences? Well, here's a slide from a presentation by a senior representative of RIVM who did the scientific work to justify the Netherlands flavor ban. And they say possible unintended consequences in this presentation. So this was at the end of December. This was in December 2022. DIY flavoring addition, less attractive as a smoking cessation tool, decreased ends use, but increased cigarette use and increased use of illicit markets. And I thought, okay, here, the rest of the presentation is going to be really interesting because we're going to find out why they think these things aren't going to happen, or what their response to them is, or are they a price worth paying. But no, this was the only presentation, the only slide in this presentation on that subject, and then they just move rapidly on. Okay, so it was a moment of candor, but the issue was just left hanging there in the auditorium. Okay, let's look at some of the evidence. I'm not going to go through all this in great detail, but we now have quasi-experimental economic data, particularly from the US, on the effect of flavor bans, some of which have been introduced in states and then not in adjacent states. So it's possible to do a kind of controlled experiment. Look at this. You know, we find a trade-off, 15 additional cigarettes for every 1 less milliliter. Encourage substitution towards traditional smoking. It was especially clear among 18 to 20-year-olds that it induced substitution to combustible cigarette smoking. So everyone who's saying we should ban flavors in vape and pouch products have to ask the question, what do you make of the evidence that suggests that it increases smoking? And the answer is frankly nothing. They don't even bother to engage with that. But that's a clear problem found in the literature. Let me look at another one now. We're going to have the tobacco tax directive, the excise directive. Okay, and this is about shaking down vapors to raise money and presumably to change behavior. Here, we have to recognize the fact that vaping, pouches, and smoking products are substitutes. So a complement would be something like coffee and cake. A substitute would be something like coffee and tea. Tea and biscuits are a complement. Biscuits and cake are a substitute, if you see what I mean. Okay, now when there's a substitute, when the price of one or the demand for one goes up, the demand for the other goes down, okay? And that is the link that we see between vaping and smoking. And again, look at some academic evidence. Again, I'm just going to flash it all up. You put a tax on vapes, increased smoking prevalence, propensity, and number of cigarettes. Substitution between cigarettes and ends for youth. Unintended effects of ends taxation. Decreased ends use but increased cigarette smoking among 18 to 25-year-olds. Increase of a particular e-cigarette tax would have translated to 2.5 million extra adult daily smokers. So who is thinking about this evidence when it comes to introducing tax on vaping, pouches, and all the rest of it? Answer, no one is. But that evidence is out there if you're willing to look for it. Okay, why is some of this going to get more difficult? Okay, I think there's a bunch of reasons why things have changed a lot since 1997. First of all, we have long supply chains starting in China with containerization. We have a tremendous amount of internet access, social media and internet marketing. We have confidential messaging systems. We have international payment systems, and we have cryptocurrency, all of which can underpin illicit trade or much more flexible trade that is much easier to avoid regulation. Okay, so we have much more diverse products now. In the EU, we probably have approaching 1 million notified products, including over 400,000 in Germany. Okay, so there's a massive diversity of products available in the market. Very difficult just to get your arms around them and regulate them all. Secondly, we have this huge growth, didn't really exist in China in the middle of the last decade. We've seen a gigantic growth in Chinese-based commerce now. Around $11 billion of trade with the US, UK, South Korea leading the market, coming from China. I saw something yesterday that said there were now 65,000 disposable vapes products available in the United States, almost all from China. The trade is ungovernable, in my view. So this is what vapes look like when they're packaged for import into the European Union or anywhere else, okay? They could be anything, basically, and you won't know until you break into these boxes. It's very easy to mislabel them. They get put in these containers. This is an example of a standard container unit, a 20-foot equivalent unit. They come in different sizes, 20-foot and 40-foot, but this is the standard unit of containerization. What is a 20-foot equivalent unit? So it's a container that's 20 foot long. how many of these do you get on a boat? You can now get over 20,000 of these containers on a single ship. Okay. And the reason I'm saying this is I want to get a feel for the size of the trade. This is the port of Rotterdam. Okay. Any idea? Can anybody have a guess at how many containers pass through this port each day? Well, it's online, so we can't really shout out, but the answer is 36,000 per day. Okay. It's absolutely huge, the trade. And the number passing through the EU. So these are the 20 largest ports in the EU by container volume in 2023 per year in millions. So Rotterdam up at the top there, 13 million per year. The total is 200,000 per day into the single European market, you know, the market without borders between states. Okay. So that is just a gigantic flow. Anybody any idea how many of these containers are inspected? I'll tell you, it's not many. 2% overall. Okay. And these ports now have criminal networks that have infiltrated them, largely for the purpose of smuggling goods, but as a way of making sure things can clear ports and customs. You know, people are bribed to turn a blind eye, to fill in false paperwork and so on. Okay. Countries that have lost regulatory control and using this kind of mechanism. Australia has some of the strictest vaping regulations in the world, yet only around 6% of Australia's products are going through the regulated pathway. 94% are going through an unregulated pathway. Okay. In other words, they're handled by criminal gangs and there's fire bombings and all the rest of it. Very similar in the United States. There's a very, very tough process run by the Food and Drug Administration, but the effect is, again, only around 5% of the products are regulated. Most of the market is unregulated. And Brazil is a complete ban, and there's a ban in like 43 countries now, not regulated at all. It means you can't put the products on the market as a legal vendor. They have to be illegal, and they are supplied. They're widely available. It's just all in the hands now of criminal networks smuggling across borders or making illicit products within the country. New communications, gigantic increase in social media. We've got now something like 5 billion potential creators everywhere, and any one of them can create an advert or be paid to create an advert for a vaping, a cigarette, or any other sort of product. So good luck with trying to control that. You can try an online ban. This is an online sales allowed, and the web traffic to local websites in blue in France, Germany, Greece, and Spain. Online sales not allowed in Austria, Belgium, Finland, and Hungary. And you can see the traffic goes to the orange bars, which is the foreign websites. So the trade doesn't stop. It just moves around like water flowing around rocks. It just moves to foreign websites. We see new forms of commerce, you know, shipping vapes with WhatsApp numbers and agreeing WhatsApp and so on. Here's someone who wants to set up a Telegram channel for wholesale disposable vapes distribution and so on. Okay. Another factor that's making things ungovernable is innovation. We're seeing, you know, innovation in response to these regulations now. So we'll get around the disposable ban. We'll get around the EU's 2 milliliter limit. That was a ridiculous thing. The norm now is to have around 15 milligrams of liquid in a tank. The EU limit is 2 milligrams. The difference is an illicit opportunity, and that's why we're seeing so many smuggled big puff devices in the European Union now. We have a daft regulation that makes it impossible for the consumers to get what they want. I'm going to run out of time. I need to carry on here. These are flavor inserts. That was DIY flavors. We now need a new model of tobacco control in which we accept the limits. Okay, so first of all, we have to think about nicotine differently. It's a psychoactive substance. It's like coffee, alcohol, increasingly cannabinoids, and we need to recognize that people are going to use it and regulate to keep it as safe as possible. Michael Russell again, there's no compelling objection to recreational drugs, providing it's not shown to be physically, psychologically, or socially harmful. Well, when you get low risk products, they're not that harmful. So then we're into, well, how do you manage the trade in this? Keep the market legal. This is my number one tobacco control concept here. If soon as it's illegal, soon as you have criminal networks, black markets, you lose complete control. This is firebombing. There's now been 200 firebombings in Australia associated with turf wars between criminal gangs. Criminal gangs are terrible. They draw kids in as suppliers, so they're not just as consumers, but they draw them in. They're completely unregulated. Okay, the way to keep something legal. This is the one example I could think of where this has worked. This is streaming music. We had an illegal file sharing system called SCOHRE in the 1990s. That was defeated by the rise of the iTunes Store, okay, and a proper offer to music users who could actually get a much better product. And the key to keeping things legal is giving adults the products that they actually want. Work through consent, not coercion. This is picking up on Carl Eric's theme from earlier, and I'm going to draw on a paper that he wrote, which is absolutely excellent. I totally recommend this. But we had a style of tobacco control which was protective and paternalistic, punitive, coercive, and stigmatizing. Tobacco control 2.0 needs to deal with users in a completely different way. Respect their own autonomy, work on informed consent, respect them as individuals, and approach them with empathy. Now, that would be a new idea, but that's the only thing that's going to work. Otherwise, users will defect and find illegal workarounds or go back to smoking. Risk proportionate regulation. We can prohibit, we can use pharmaceutical regulation, or we can regulate like cigarettes. The only one that will work for public health is to use risk proportionate regulation. Stiff measures for the cigarettes, hand rolling, and other combustibles, and then consumer protection measures that encourage switching from high risk to low risk, okay, for the vaping products, okay.
Sorry to interrupt you.
I'm sorry.
You have just 1 minute left, Ned.
Okay, I'm just about to finish.
Okay.
We need to address concerns about youth. We need to recognize that the dominant population at risk is adults who smoke, and we need to think in terms of kids who would otherwise have smoked. If they're vaping, that's a win. We need to have a program for young people, but above all, we need to be realists and we need to be proud. In other words, we need to accept the limits of tobacco control, go with the grain of what users will do, try to reduce the risk to people who want to use nicotine. That's it. That's my tobacco control 2.0 over, and I'm sorry for overrunning.
Thank you very much, Clive, for another brilliant talk and for being such a keen observer and a fearless communicator. I think we have to hurry on to our final speaker because he's going to leave us early on. So we will have to welcome back Professor Andrzej Foll from Poland. He's been a returning speaker at SCOHRE webinars. Professor Foll is president of the Polish Society of Public Health, and he served as the director of the Institute of Medical Science. He has a long and very productive career, over 350 scientific publications, and received a long list of awards. Today, in his talk, Professor Foll will ask the question, will the new directive meet expectations? And then it remains to be seen if he also can provide the answers to that question. So please, Professor Foll.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this kind introduction. Yeah, I really tried to address the question that was put as a title of my today's presentation. The only extra question for this would be from whose perspective is gonna meet the expectation, because we've heard already this afternoon from the eminent speakers before the perspective of a legislator, the perspective of consumer. So depending on whose perspective we take, either the directive will or will not fulfill it. I do absolutely agree with what Dr. Lund and other speakers said, that the in the history of the mankind, we always used to smoke and drink something. So I cannot imagine now so huge changes that the Homo sapiens will stop smoking and drinking. I used to smoke myself. Even being a pulmonary physician, I used to smoke for 20 years, and then I quit it to the great joy of my children and my wife. Why now is a good time to talk about the European tobacco policy? Because, as already has been mentioned, we introduced, or the EU adopted the first directive over 20 years ago. And there was only one major revision in the meantime. And we always claim that to see the result in public health of some systemic changes, especially if the results have to be seen in development of diseases or mortality from the diseases, we need more or less 20 years to pass. Yes, when we look at the curve of changing regulations in the United States and the changing curve of the deaths of the pulmonary diseases, especially pulmonary cancer, well, the increase in the cancer followed by 20 years, the increase of smoking cigarettes, and the decrease in cancer followed by 20 years, all the decisions that led to lower cigarette consumption. So at 20 years, it's quite a good period in public health. So talking or discussing the nicotine or cigarette law in Europe after 20 years is a good time, especially when we look at the change in smoking in most of the Europe region. It's not only EU, it's the Europe region of WHO, which is not much bigger than the EU territory. But still, when we look at the countries, we see that in most countries, and these are at the left part of the graph, have only a little bit changed their bad habits. So the citizens of the countries, they dropped smoking by 5 to 10% in the past 15 years, because this data compare 2000 and 2016, and only those. And look here, we have all the countries. The countries we have: Sweden, we have Denmark, we have Iceland, we have Norway and Finland. So only in these countries the success was much bigger in these years. So the drop in smoking was more than 10%, which was due to what has been already discussed, to some alternatives that were more common and more widely given to those who used to smoke in this country. And what happened in Poland in that time? Also, Empower has been mentioned. Well, I'm not a special fan of Empower, because when I look at this, Poland is doing quite well as far as the Empower states. We are fulfilling most of the things required. We are doing quite well. As you know, the darker the blue is, the better we're doing. Well, we're doing so fine, and the number of smokers in recent years, rises. So it was around 8 million 5 years ago, then it dropped to 7 million something, and then now it's over 8 million again. So we're doing so fine in Empower, and we're not doing quite well in the number of smoking polls. Prepare answer or analysis for the parliament on where are we with the smoking epidemics, as they wanted it to be called at that time. So I worked on that together with the Polish Society of Public Health, and we worked out. So we gave by the end 7 general regulations. I'll not focus on all of them, but I'll focus in terms of directive today on 4 of them. First of all, we suggested to introduce licensing for every single spot selling cigarettes or other nicotine-containing products. So briefly speaking, to all the products that are being covered by the directive regulations. radically increase the excise tax and keep it being raised every year, so that these raises will become inevitable, and every smoking person or intended to start smoking would be aware that every year his or her habit will be more and more expensive. This is inevitable. I know that every year, no matter the inflation rate, I will lose plus 10%, because by this 10%, the price will increase because of the excise tax or other instruments. Then it has also been approached by two speakers this afternoon. There are several research, and there are so many people saying, well, this is company-sponsored research, this is the industry research. Well, we have only industry research in pharmaceutical companies, but well, it's another story, and we accept it for the drug registration. But okay, just to stop these arguments and losing time on discussion upon the reality or liability of the research, let's fund from the public sources and supervised by public means a progressive research that finally will give some answers about the relativity of influence over our health of the products that we have and that we will in the future. And then, if we prove it, just let's put the taxation and all other means that we have, especially financial or taxation means, that we sort these products due to the regulation, less harm, less tax. The less harm the product causes, the less tax is being put on it, so that, well, the cheaper, the more financially available the product is in the market. Of course, if we prove first that there are differences, I think there will be no objection to this attitude, because otherwise we spend the past 10 years disputing this over and over. So, first one of the 4 points that we dealt with, so we sent to our parliament, was that the cigarettes are too much available, so they are simply too cheap. When you look here, the Poland is here at the bottom, 2.8 pounds. Well, let's switch to euro, and this is the data from 2022. Poland is the second cheapest cigarettes in Europe, around €3, 3.20. And of course, we have 26 or even 28% of daily smokers, with the absolute number of smokers, as I showed you before, increasing, now being over 8 million. So it has something to do that the cheap cigarettes are really making the smoking population bigger. So let's put it the first thing to make it more expensive. Yes. As it has been suggested, the new government, that we had a huge government change, as you might recall last year, introduced new taxation regulations, especially on excise tax. And the prediction is that the availability of cigarettes will decrease, so the price will increase, so the availability will decrease for the first time in the past decade, because for the past decade, well, the availability was increasing, now will probably decrease, which is the way to go, and which is something that also the directive should focus on, to have it done or to have it set in all European countries. So in our opinion, in a directive, there should be written that the member state must reduce the financial availability of cigarettes. This is one of the major things that has to be stated there. Second thing that we suggested to the Polish Parliament was funding this research from public funding and with public supervision, just once forever, to make sure which products are safer or are they safer at all, and then to use it as a preparation of new taxation list or a price list for the market. Well, we have several already existing more publications. I'm sorry, publications showing or presenting the relatively different risk of several diseases, starting with lung cancer, going over stomach cancer or bladder cancer, or then with the COPD, so chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and so on and so forth. But as I said, there are many who objected, including many scientific organizations as European Respiratory Society, saying, well, these are not the evidence-based medicine data, so we cannot take it under consideration. Well, there are still some very important documents, and as one of the most important approaching the COPD, so once again, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so-called cigarette disease, a treatment diagnosis in the world, that, well, they do not support the thesis that there are differences, but they, for the first time, assume that the doctor can provide his patient with something else that the nicotine substitutes. So can provide supplementary materials or tools. This is the first time statement. So, well, something is being on. And Dr. Bates just told us about the situation in the United Kingdom, and he mentioned shortly the tobacco and vapes bill. And yes, I also looked across this document, and especially with the BTS supporting. BTS is British Thoracic Society. So this is a national society combining all the doctors and other medical practitioners dealing with thoracic, so pulmonary diseases. So please see that although they believe that people who do not smoke should not start vaping. So that vaping should be available, and this is being said in the paragraph 3.9, should be available to those who smoke to support them in quitting smoking. And they encourage all the medical practitioners to use this as a tool to support those who want to quit smoking. But this is the limited group, as discussed also by Dr. Lund, as up to 30%, if at all, people are really willing to quit. But still, these are the two only things that I found supporting by now the alternative techniques of nicotine delivery that can be used in the process of cigarette quitting. So what, in our opinion, should be placed into the directive in this matter? So the member state must carry out studies, as already mentioned, but in the meantime, before the results are available, because it's going to take 3 years, 4 years, I don't know how long, depending on the protocol of the studies. In the meantime, the countries should build their policy on the experience of the countries that had more success than the others. And we looked at the number of smokers. I showed you that the decrease in the number of smokers in the 15-year period was biggest in the northern countries. So we need to focus, in my opinion, of course, and to, as much as it's possible, of course, to take some elements of their policy to introduce into the entire European policy, because obviously they have the success that the rest of Europe lacks by now. Finally, coming to the excise tax as a tool in public health. This is New Zealand, and what I wanted to stress is that when we use one tool, let's say taxation. Please look here at the blue line. First, 10 annual 10% tax increases. Well, they worked, but they work slowly. But when you combine several tools, and let's say at the same time, the red line, you have a general smoking not our future campaign for the youth, preparing them to be not smokers when they grow up. You know what happened to this project. Anyway, we all know. But still, only combining several tools together will lead to some faster effects because, well, once again, using one tool in this case, no matter how powerful this tool would be, is not the way to obtain the goal, and most likely it's not the way to obtain the goal fast. But when we look at, as I mentioned, that the new government has moved forward, and when we look at the excise tax introduced now in 2024, so middle last year, we already see a decrease in smokers that is established for the 2 years to come. By 200,000 people are expected to quit smoking or switch just because of the real big excise increase in Poland. So I think that this is the way to go, and this is the way also we would like to advise to the directive. When we look at the prices in Europe and on the cigarettes in Europe, I showed you the graph first, but let's look at the numbers only. The average price before taxes is around €1, €1.50, let's say. After taxes is €6 something. Well, in Poland it's €3, so it's obviously too cheap. But that's why, I'm sorry. We would suggest the middle line here. It may be worth considering introducing a minimum price in every country in relation to the average salary, because, well, the minimum price in Germany, Poland, and let's say Czechia cannot be the same because the average, so the purchasing power of the society is different. So it has to be it has to be adjusted to that. But still, we find it being a good idea that every country would have a minimum price that's saying that I cannot buy more than X packs of cigarettes monthly from my salary. Well, still, the most important thing on the fiscal side is that the member states must use the excise tax and other fiscal tools in a priority to set the prices of the cigarettes high enough to make them less affordable and to introduce what I already mentioned, the less harm, less tax policy, to have other alternatives more readily available, because otherwise people will not quit. If there is not so many of smokers, I've been smoking for 20 years. There's not so many of smokers who from day to day just quit without supporting themselves with some extra product, with some extra nicotine, with whatever. So this is important to make it again parallel. At one way, increase the prices of cigarettes. On the other, have available other tools that can support those poor quitters in the time of quitting the habit. And finally, something that also has been already addressed: visibility at the point of sale. Well, this cannot be the image that smokers or children or adolescents see entering almost every fuel station in Poland, on every local small shop in Poland. So this is what they see. Maybe it's half the size of what I put in this picture, but still is a wall full of many makes and many types of cigarettes readily available. Well, in Poland is functioning also very recently, for the past year, a track and trace tobacco product system. And the thing that we really indeed and try to convince the regulators to increase is the point 4, because all the participants of the tobacco trade are already registered. So they need to register, they need to get a special number, otherwise they will not be able to purchase from the wholesale, from the wholesaler any cigarette. But we would like to go a little bit further, because when we look at the theory of the public health, the primary prevention, which is between primordial and the secondary, requires regulation of the market. And we suggest licensing the retail sellers, not only that they register, but licensing, as all the alcohol selling places need to be licensed. We suggest that all the cigarette selling places also should be licensed. So again, to the directive, we would add that the sale and promotion for all the products covered with the directive should be subject to the same regulations, because we do agree, or this is our opinion, that these products should be addressed most of all to those who are smoking and want to quit, not to those who do not smoke. So the regulations should be the same, and the availability and visibility in the market should be the same, but still they have to be preferred in terms of price, taxation, and so on and so forth. Putting it together, these are the suggestions that we want, or we would like, the 5 suggestions we would like to give to the directive. To my knowledge, only 2 of them are now in the text of the directive. So answering the question that was in the title of this presentation, would the directive, I would answer no. From the point of view of public health, this directive is not quite enough. It's not quite what we would like to have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andrei. I know you have to leave us now, but please have a look at the chat box later on, because there are some comments and questions for you.
Yes, I'm so sorry to leave, but I have also an online meeting of my university faculty that I absolutely need to join. So I'm so sorry. It was a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
We understand. Thank you very much for your participation. Well, there's one comment here. We have 3 minutes left, and I would like Clive or Damien to comment on that. It's about the ban on single-use disposable vapes, which is now being enforced in many EU countries, it seems. It's probably some compelling arguments for banning this type of e-cigarettes, I guess. But one counter-argument seems has been that these bans are these bans are really doing is delaying the inevitable upcoming EU battery directive that anyway will deal with single-use or batteries of all types. Do you know anything about this, Damien or Clive?
I do. The proposals to ban disposables that we're seeing, I think the UK was one of the last to introduce, or to say they're going to introduce it, as well as France and Belgium. They're completely irrelevant, because the EU battery directive has already been agreed upon, and I think it's going to come into effect late 2026 or 2027, and that will basically do what the disposable bans are intending to do. It's going to regulate for single-use throwaway batteries across, not just for vapes, but across everything. So, I mean, the market will have to evolve. What you have as disposables now will have to become rechargeable. You won't have the environmental waste to the same extent. But, I mean, the thing with disposables is they're actually a very useful tool as well for older people and for people with mobility issues, with arthritis and various things. But yeah, as the proposals are at the minute, they are an irrelevance. But in my opinion, it's lazy policy, because they're not popular among people who don't use them. So there is a lot of support for these types of bans. And as Professor Fall just said, that people being asked about this are people who don't use the products. They don't use vapes. They don't smoke. So, it's lazy from a policy perspective. That is something that politicians think is going to be popular, so they're going ahead, even though in light of the EU battery directive, it's completely irrelevant. So that's my views on that. The products are evolving as it is. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So lazy politicians then. Anything to add to that, Clive? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I completely agree with Damien. I mean, it's an incredibly casual piece of policy making. I mean, maybe 60% of vapers are using these products. They're using it for a reason, either because they're cheap, they're convenient, they're easy, they work in different circumstances. There's no fiddling around or fun. So you have to be very careful when you just ban something that millions of people are using as an alternative to smoking across the whole EU. It's incredibly reckless. And the most reckless and idiotic of all is the UK government on this, which produced an impact assessment suggesting that 29% of disposable single-use users may return to smoking. And when you do the numbers on that, that's about 750,000 people in the UK. And it's like, didn't anyone go, well, maybe that's a really bad idea? We've got 750,000 vapers, and they might suddenly become smokers again, just because we ban these things. And just to double down on the incredibly stupid, lazy policy making, we have a limit in the EU, and it's applied in the UK, of the 2 milliliter tank size. Yet the popular brands in the United States, North America now are, 6 times that. They're 12 milliliter devices, so-called big puff devices. What if we just change the limit? What if we just change the limit from 2 to 12? For the same amount of nicotine, you would have roughly 1/6 as many devices at a 12 milliliter tank as a 2 milliliter tank. But nobody seemed to think of that. Nobody thought, really, pointless EU regulation is driving some of this waste. Why don't we deal with that head on? And also that would create slightly more expensive products and create more of a barrier to entry. So I just feel the laziness and the performative nature of the policy making here is kind of off the scale. So I agree with Damien, of course.
Okay, thank you for that. And this has to be our final comment, I'm afraid, because we're running out of time. I want to thank you then, both Professor Paul and Clive and Damien, for taking the time with us and providing their valuable insights and reflections. The whole session has been recorded, so the audience can rewatch it anytime. So thank you very much for watching, and thank you for participating, and have a nice afternoon.